Hey y'all, as promised I wanted to put together a quick video about table layouts and countdown timers, since those are the two topics we didn't get a chance to talk about in class today. Now table layouts are much like the name implies. It's a layout that arranges its children into rows and columns. Um, it's a lot like CSS, in fact. I'll zoom that in so it's a little bit easier to see in the video. The biggest difference though is a table layout is going to consist of table rows. Okay, each table row is kind of like a sub layout, kind of like if you think about how we nested linear layouts inside of linear layouts previously, each of those rows is going to define the elements of the table itself, of that row. Here's where it gets a little bit different than HTML. So for example, in HTML, you would define the table and then you would define a TR. In HTML, you would then define TD and you would put content inside the TD. However, in Android, the table row will accept any view object as a child or as a cell. So if I want a table row that contains, say, 5 text views, I would define a table row, and then I would just put the 5 text views. Each text view then counts as the cell. If you need multiple elements to count as a cell, then you need to use a sub layout and have that layout count as the cell, and then whatever you put inside of it. You can leave cells empty if you want. You can span columns just like you can in HTML. By default, it will each row will just be, or the number of columns will be based on whatever the longest row is. A lot like what you're used to in HTML. So it's fairly easy to use. Let's walk you through that really quickly. I've got just a brand new application. I just opened it up, started it out as default, and here we are. So if we go to the Android's activity, I'm going to change out, just so you can see how table layout goes, I'm going to make the parent a table. Now generally, we don't do that. You would have other layouts and then the table is an element of the other layouts, but for simplicity, excuse me, I want to have the table layout just be at the root of our view here. And inside of my table layout, we need to get rid of that text view because the text view can be the children, but again, the children belong not inside a table layout, but inside a table row. We can use design view if we want, inside of layouts, and if we want to just drag down. This is what I like to do when I have several rows that I need to build out, is I like to drag them out. Be careful though that it doesn't nest in like that. If it does, just grab it and drag it out a level, drag it sideways, so then they'll show up on the same level, rather than being a table row inside of there. We don't need to nest those two. Likewise, say for example I wanted to have a number of text fields or a number of buttons or whatever inside of these. It's easy to get the boilerplate of what I need to be in place in each element. So for example, let's say I wanted some text views. I could, inside of my table row, right now there's one text view, which means I have one column. If I put 2 text views, now I have 2 columns. I could do 3 text views and have 3 columns, or 4, or 5. I think you get the idea. As many elements as I put in my row, that will now be the number of columns that I have belonging to my table. Likewise, I can take and say drag some more text views down into my second table row if I want. 3, 4, and 5. This gives me my basics of my table. I've got a table layout, I've got a table row with my width and my height, and my text views inside of it. Now the one thing to be careful of, let's go ahead and run this. Okay, just like with other layouts and other elements, we want to be careful what we do with our widths and our heights. As well as we want to be careful about where things position. So by default, if you look back in the design view while we're waiting for that build to run and install, you'll notice that our text fields are touching closely together. If I wanted them to instead split the difference, I would need to use layout weights, and I could also come in and set some gravities and other things if I wanted to span across. But by default, my text views are just going to squish up together like this. Same thing with like if you want buttons or whatever else you want to do. We'd do that same that same thing. Okay, so table rows and table layouts are very simple to work with. In fact, if I didn't want, let's say I wanted to do a text view and then a button, text view and a button, I can intermix and interchange as many of these as I want, and it will still run just the way you expect. With my columns lining up, notice this text view here lines up to this text view here, even though that leaves some extra space because they're in columns coming vertically down the screen, just like you'd expect with a table. By default, tables don't have padding, they don't have borders and other things like that. You can add some of those elements if you want, minus the borders. We don't do that in tables. But that kind of gets you the basics of how to work with a table row and a table layout. You just mix and match whatever other elements you want inside of your layout. Now, let's talk really briefly as well about countdown timers. Now, countdown timers are another really useful tool. If we open up another tab to it here, but when we want to have just a countdown until a time in the future, we give intervals along the way based on whatever we specify. So for example, let's say we wanted to have a 30-second countdown in a new text displaying in a text field. We generate a new countdown timer, and it's going to have two methods that need to be defined inside of it. On tick, which means whatever I defined as my tick, that's the second argument right here, in milliseconds, it will give us an increment along the way from there. We can set in milliseconds again how long we want the whole thing to take. So if we go ahead and copy this text field or this chunk of code, we're going to come over here and I'm going to get rid of some of this complexity that we've got here and just go, let's just show you with a single text field now. I'm going to get rid of my tables and we're going to insert a text field instead, so we can watch this thing count down. And we're going to call this guy, we're going to give it an ID. I'm going to call it, let's see, txt countdown. Then inside of my activity, or wherever you wanted to instantiate your countdown timer, we're going to need to create that, that countdown timer. Oh, my computer is really struggling today. Apparently I have too many tabs open. I'm also going to create a private variable of type text view, because that's the thing we're going to set it to, text countdown. And I need to make sure to populate this, because that's what I want it to set it to. So equals text view, find view by ID, r.id dot tx countdown. Okay, now this creates the countdown timer anonymously. If you want, you're welcome to store it in a variable. For example, if you needed to stop it or restart it or other things like that, it would be useful to have a reference for it. But just so you can see how it functions, when I create my countdown temperature or my countdown timer, I'll define how many milliseconds that I want it to count down from. So for how far in the future to the end? What's the total length in milliseconds? How often do I want to be notified? So in this case, I'm saying 30 seconds in total, and tell me every second along the way so that I can tick my countdown timer. And then on tick, I'm setting the text to seconds remaining, and then taking the milliseconds until finished, dividing it by 1,000, essentially converting my milliseconds to seconds. Likewise, on finish, we'll change the text field to say done. The key thing to remember, especially if you're doing this anonymously, is to make sure you call the .start. That's what initiates the timer. So if we go ahead and run this one more time, we'll let Gradle go ahead and build and install our application, and we'll watch our countdown timer go. All right. And now we can see our countdown timer remaining, time remaining. In fact, why don't we do this to make it a little bit more fun? Let's take our text view and let's give it a text appearance so it's a little bit easier to read. There we go. And that way it'll be a little bit easier for you guys to see in the video. There we go. Seconds remaining. And we count down from there. Now, in the case of your assignment, obviously things will need to be a little bit different. You'll need to do something other than set text to done when you're done. You may not want to make it anonymously like this. You may want to have a reference to it. But I just wanted to show you quickly how to use a countdown timer as well as the table layout. If you have any questions about either of those, feel free to email me, and we'll go from there. Thanks, guys.